This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The Nakamura family lived in a traditional, sprawling house tucked away in a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Tokyo. The house was a blend of old and new. Its wooden sliding doors, tatami-matted rooms, and a meticulously kept rock garden evoked a sense of history, while modern appliances and a large flat-screen television hinted at the family's efforts to keep up with the times. To an outsider, the Nakamuras seemed to have it all: a stable home, a successful patriarch, and the kind of order that many Japanese families aspired to maintain. But behind the paper-thin walls of their home lay a simmering tension that none of them could escape. The family of seven was presided over by Keiji Nakamura, a stern and disciplined man in his mid-40s who worked as a high-ranking manager at a major electronics firm. Keiji prided himself on being the provider and decision-maker, his voice the loudest and his opinions rarely challenged. Beneath his composed exterior, however, was a man prone to anger, whose harsh words often left invisible scars on his children and wife. Eiko Nakamura, his wife, was the epitome of a traditional homemaker, tirelessly cooking, cleaning, and caring for her children. Though she radiated warmth in public, at home she was often distant, her focus solely on maintaining order rather than addressing the emotional needs of her family. The eldest son, Ren, was 17 and the pride of the family. Ren was everything Keiji had hoped for in a son: disciplined, academically gifted, and bound for a prestigious university. His achievements were often paraded in front of the family, his awards displayed prominently in the living room. Ren thrived on praise, but his success came at a cost. He was cold and dismissive toward his younger siblings, particularly Haruka, whom he saw as a failure in comparison. Haruka, the middle child, was 13 and felt invisible in the shadow of her brother's accomplishments. A quiet and introverted girl, she spent most of her time alone in her room, sketching in a notebook that she kept hidden from the rest of the family. Her dark, elaborate drawings were her only escape from the suffocating environment of the Nakamura household. The youngest members of the family were the 6-year-old twins, Akira and Ayumi, who were the light of their parents' lives. They were bubbly and full of energy, their laughter often echoing through the house despite the undercurrent of tension. Eiko doted on them incessantly, lavishing them with attention and affection that Haruka had long since stopped receiving. The twins were blissfully unaware of the growing divide between their siblings and the silent storm brewing within their home. Adding to the dynamic were Kiji's elderly parents, Ichiro and Hana, who lived with the family in the traditional custom of multi-generational households. Ichiro, a retired school principal, spent most of his days tending to the garden or sitting on the veranda, reading the newspaper. He was strict but fair, though age had softened his once formidable presence. Hana, on the other hand, was frail and quiet, her health declining steadily. She rarely left her room, her days a blur of tea ceremonies and hushed conversations with Eiko about family matters. Haruka felt like an outsider in her own family. She had always been quiet, but as she entered adolescence, her silence deepened into isolation. She struggled to keep up with her father's impossible expectations, her mother's indifference, and her siblings' superiority. Ren, the golden child, was held up as the standard against which she was always measured, and her parents' disappointment in her was palpable. Her younger siblings, oblivious to her pain, consumed what little attention was left, leaving Haruka to fend for herself emotionally. Her grandparents, though kind in their own reserved way, were distant figures in her life, more focused on maintaining their own routines than noticing her struggles. The Nakamura household operated like a well-oiled machine, each member playing their role to maintain the appearance of harmony. Meals were eaten together in silence, with only the occasional exchange of pleasantries or reprimands breaking the stillness. Keiji sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding, while Eiko flitted between serving food and scolding the children for minor infractions. Haruka often sat quietly, staring at her plate, her mind elsewhere as her family's conversations flowed around her without her involvement. The family's rigid routine extended to every aspect of their lives, from the way they greeted each other in the morning to the strict bedtime enforced by Keiji. The weight of these routines, expectations, and disappointments bore down on Haruka like an invisible cage. She felt trapped in a life where she was constantly reminded of her inadequacies, her voice drowned out by the needs and desires of everyone else. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, had become a prison, its thin walls amplifying every argument, every word of criticism, and every moment of neglect. Haruka began to retreat further into herself, her thoughts growing darker with each passing day. From the outside, the Nakamura family appeared unshakable, their traditional values and disciplined lifestyle a testament to their success. But inside, the fractures were deepening, and the tension was becoming unbearable. Haruka's growing isolation and resentment were invisible to those around her, hidden beneath a facade of quiet compliance. The house, with its meticulously kept garden and orderly rooms, was a powder keg waiting for a spark. And as Haruka's thoughts turned increasingly toward escape, she began to wonder if the only way out was through the destruction of everything and everyone she had ever known. Haruka Nakamura lived a life of quiet desperation, her struggles buried beneath the orderly facade of her family's existence. To the world, she was an ordinary 13-year-old girl, unremarkable in her demeanor and unworthy of a second glance. But beneath her calm exterior lay a churning sea of emotions: resentment, fear, loneliness that grew stronger with each passing day. Haruka felt like an invisible thread in the tapestry of her family, barely noticed unless she did something wrong. Her parents saw her as a disappointment, her older brother treated her as a burden, and her younger siblings basked in the affection that had once been hers. There was no place for her in the Nakamura household, no space where she could simply be. From a young age, Haruka had been different. She wasn't loud or outgoing like other children her age. Instead, she preferred solitude, spending hours drawing in her room or reading books that transported her to other worlds. Her artistic talent, once praised by her grandparents as a sign of creativity, was now dismissed by her father as frivolous. "Art won't get you into a good school," he would say, a sentiment echoed by her mother's subtle but cutting remarks. Haruka's sketchbooks, once filled with colorful landscapes and cheerful characters, began to take on a darker tone. The figures she drew were twisted and shadowed, their faces distorted into expressions of pain and anger. Her drawings became her only outlet, a way to release the emotions she couldn't express out loud. At school, Haruka's life was no easier. She was neither popular nor entirely ignored, existing in a liminal space where her presence was tolerated but not valued. Her classmates often teased her for her quiet nature, calling her weird or creepy when they saw her sketching during breaks. The few friendships she managed to form were fleeting, dissolving as her peers drifted toward more outgoing and socially adept classmates. Haruka learned to accept her isolation, though the sting of rejection never fully faded. Each unkind word, each mocking laugh, became another weight on her already heavy heart. The pressure at home was relentless. Keiji, her father, held impossibly high expectations for his children, and Haruka was no exception. Ren, her older brother, had thrived under this pressure, becoming the model son that Keiji proudly boasted about to colleagues and friends. Haruka, on the other hand, struggled to keep up. Her grades were average, and no matter how hard she studied, she could never match Ren's academic achievements. Her father's disapproval was a constant presence in her life, manifesting in scathing comments and stern lectures. Her mother, Eiko, offered little solace, her attention consumed by the younger twins and the never-ending demands of running the household. Haruka began to feel like an afterthought, a shadow trailing behind the bright lights of her siblings. Ren's success overshadowed her every effort, while Akira and Ayumi's innocence and charm absorbed what little affection was left. Her grandparents, once a source of comfort, grew more distant as their health declined, their focus shifting inward. Haruka's sense of worth eroded until she believed she had none. She began to see herself as a burden, an unwanted presence in a family that would be happier without her. As her isolation deepened, Haruka's thoughts grew darker. She spent hours lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and replaying every slight, every harsh word, every moment of neglect. Her resentment toward her family began to fester, turning into something she didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. She resented her father's constant criticism, her mother's indifference, Ren's condescension, and the twins' obliviousness to her pain. She felt trapped in a cycle of expectation and failure, unable to escape the suffocating confines of her life. Haruka's online world became her sanctuary. Late at night, when the house was silent and the only light came from her computer screen, she delved into forums and websites that explored the darker corners of human nature. She read about people who had committed unthinkable acts, their stories simultaneously horrifying and fascinating. She didn't see herself in them, not at first. But as her anger grew, she began to wonder if they too had felt the way she did. Alone. Invisible. Powerless. She started to write her own thoughts in an anonymous journal, spilling her darkest feelings into words that no one else would ever read. Each entry was a release, a way to process the storm inside her. The breaking point came gradually, a culmination of years of neglect and pain. Small incidents: her father scolding her for a missed homework assignment, her mother brushing off her attempts to talk, Ren dismissing her with a sneer, began to weigh heavier than they should have. Haruka found herself fantasizing about a life without her family, a life where she was free from their expectations and judgment. At first, the fantasies were simple daydreams, fleeting and harmless. But over time, they became darker, more detailed, and disturbingly vivid. Her resentment turned into something sharper, a blade honed by years of feeling unseen and unloved. Haruka began to fixate on the idea of taking control, of forcing her family to see her not as a failure or a burden, but as someone who mattered. She knew these thoughts were wrong, that they terrified her as much as they exhilarated her, but she couldn't stop them. They played out in her mind like a movie, the ending always the same: silence. A house free of the constant noise of her siblings, the scolding tones of her parents, and the suffocating weight of her own inadequacy. Haruka's hidden struggles were invisible to those around her, masked by her quiet demeanor and the rigid routines of her family's life. No one saw the storm brewing behind her downcast eyes or noticed the darkness creeping into her once bright sketches. Her family, so focused on their own lives, never realized that Haruka was slipping further and further away, her thoughts spiraling into a place they could never reach. She was a girl on the edge, teetering between despair and something far more dangerous, her struggles hidden in plain sight. The days leading up to the tragedy in the Nakamura household unfolded with an eerie sense of normalcy, masking the storm building within Haruka. The family's routine remained unchanged. Kiji left for work early, barking final instructions at the breakfast table. Aiko spent her days cleaning and managing household chores. Ren buried himself in his studies, preparing for university entrance exams, and the twins, Akira and Ayumi, filled the house with their endless chatter. Haruka, as always, lingered in the background, her presence acknowledged only when necessary. To the outside world, the Nakamuras appeared to be a picture of harmony, but the truth was far more complex. Haruka's inner turmoil had reached a boiling point. Each day felt heavier than the last, her mind teetering between numbness and an overwhelming rage she could barely contain. Every interaction with her family was a reminder of her invisibility. Her father's gruff commands grated on her nerves, his dismissive tone cutting deeper than he realized. Her mother's distracted kindness, reserved almost exclusively for the twins, felt like a slap in the face. Ren's offhand remarks about her lack of ambition echoed in her mind long after he spoke them. Even the twins, blissfully unaware of the tension around them, became symbols of the attention and affection Haruka had been denied. In the quiet hours of the night, while the rest of the family slept, Haruka retreated into her room and let her thoughts unravel. Her sketchbook became a journal of sorts, filled with dark, chaotic images that mirrored her emotions. She drew faceless figures standing over crumpled forms, jagged lines slicing through the paper like the edges of her thoughts. These sessions left her feeling both drained and alive, as though she were exercising a part of herself that she couldn't control. But the relief never lasted. By morning, the anger would return, heavier than before, suffocating her beneath its weight. One evening, Haruka found herself in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she cleaned up after dinner. The knives, neatly arranged on the counter, caught her attention. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of the largest blade. It was heavier than she expected, the handle fitting snugly in her hand. For a moment she stood frozen, staring at her reflection in the polished surface of the blade. The image was distorted, her face warped and twisted, as if the knife could see the truth she was hiding. She placed it back carefully, her heart pounding. But the thought lingered long after she left the room. The idea of holding power in her hands, of taking control in a way she had never been able to, was intoxicating. Haruka began to pay closer attention to her family's routines. She watched her father as he read the newspaper in the evenings, noting how he often fell asleep on the couch before retreating to bed. She observed her mother's meticulous cleaning schedule, noticing how the twins were always bathed and tucked into bed by 8. Ren stayed up late studying, but he rarely left his room, his door closed and his headphones blocking out the world. Even her grandparents followed a predictable pattern, with Ichiro retiring to the garden after dinner and Hana resting early in her room. Haruka memorized these details, her mind working quietly, calculatingly, as she planned. Small incidents pushed her closer to the edge. One morning, her father berated her for forgetting to take out the trash, his voice cutting through her like a blade. That evening, her mother scolded her for not helping with the twins' homework, her tone sharp and accusatory. Ren, oblivious to her growing despair, laughed when she tripped over his bag in the hallway, brushing past her without a second glance. Haruka absorbed it all, her resentment growing sharper with every slight. She began to feel like a bomb ticking down to zero, the pressure inside her building with no release. As the days passed, Haruka's behavior began to change. She spent more time alone, retreating into the farthest corners of the house to avoid her family. Her appetite dwindled, and her once pale complexion took on a ghostly pallor. When her mother noticed and asked if she was feeling unwell, Haruka mumbled a response, brushing off the concern. It was the first time in years that Eiko had expressed any interest in Haruka's well-being, and the irony of it stung. That night, Haruka cried for the first time in months, her tears falling silently onto her pillow as the darkness closed in around her. Haruka's fixation with the knife grew. She would sneak into the kitchen late at night, her bare feet silent on the cold tile floor, and hold it in her hands. The weight of it was comforting, grounding her in a way that nothing else could. She imagined what it would feel like to use it, to finally release the storm inside her. The images were vivid, almost cinematic, playing out in her mind like a story she couldn't stop telling herself. The thought of silence, the kind of silence that came with finality, was both terrifying and alluring. On the day everything changed, Haruka felt an eerie calm settle over her. The family had gathered for dinner, the usual chaos of clinking chopsticks and overlapping conversations filling the room. Haruka sat at the edge of the table, her movements mechanical as she ate. Her father made a remark about Ren's latest achievement, and her mother praised the twins for finishing their homework without fuss. No one spoke to Haruka. No one noticed the way her hands shook slightly as she placed her bowl down. She excused herself early, retreating to her room and closing the door behind her. The world outside faded into a muffled hum, and for the first time, Haruka felt completely alone. That night, the house was quiet. The lights went out one by one, each room plunging into darkness. Haruka sat on her bed, staring at the knife she had taken from the kitchen. The air felt heavy, the silence oppressive, as if the entire house were holding its breath. Her mind was clear, the storm inside her replaced by a chilling sense of purpose. She stood, the knife glinting faintly in the moonlight streaming through her window, and took her first step toward the point of no return. The house was enveloped in an eerie silence as Haruka moved through the darkened hallways, the knife clutched tightly in her hand. It was well past midnight, and the rhythmic hum of cicadas outside only emphasized the stillness within. The moonlight filtered through the paper-thin shoji screens, casting faint patterns on the floor as Haruka's bare feet made no sound against the wood. Her breathing was steady, her heart pounding in her chest with a mixture of fear and resolve. The storm inside her had quieted, replaced by a cold, detached focus. For once, she felt entirely in control. She started with her father, Kiji. He was asleep in the master bedroom, his loud snores echoing faintly down the hall. Haruka pushed the door open slowly, her movements deliberate. The room was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of a digital clock on the bedside table. Kiji lay on his back, his face relaxed in sleep, a stark contrast to the stern, critical expression she had known all her life. Haruka stood over him for a moment, the knife trembling slightly in her hand. Her mind was quiet, free of doubt. She raised the blade and brought it down with all the strength she could muster. The sound was muted, the blade sinking into flesh with a sickening resistance. Kiji's eyes flew open, confusion and pain flickering across his face. He tried to move, to cry out, but Haruka was relentless. She struck again and again, her hands slick with blood, her movements mechanical and driven. His struggle was brief, his strength no match for the surprise and the force of her assault. When it was over, the room was eerily still, the only sound her ragged breathing and the faint rustling of the curtains as the night breeze crept through a crack in the window. Her mother, Eiko, stirred at the noise, her figure shifting beneath the covers. Haruka turned toward her, the knife gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Eiko's eyes opened, her expression shifting from groggy confusion to horror as she registered the scene before her. She tried to scream, but Haruka moved quickly, her blade silencing her before the sound could escape. Eiko's resistance was frantic but brief, her struggles growing weaker with each passing moment until she, too, was still. Haruka stared at her mother's lifeless body, her chest heaving as the weight of what she had done began to settle over her. There was no turning back now. The next room belonged to her grandparents Ichiro and Hana. They were light sleepers, and the commotion from the master bedroom had already stirred them. Haruka could hear Ichiro's cane tapping against the floor as he moved toward the hallway. She slipped out of her parents' room and met him at the door, her movements quick and precise. Ichiro's reaction was slow, his frail body unable to process what was happening. Haruka struck swiftly, her hands steady despite the blood that coated them. Hana, still in bed, called out in a trembling voice, her tone filled with confusion and fear. Haruka turned her attention to her grandmother, her heart heavy with a strange, detached sorrow as she approached the elderly woman. Hana's cries were soft and pleading, But Haruka's resolve did not waver. The room fell silent once more. The hardest part came next. The twins, Akira and Ayumi, were in their shared bedroom at the end of the hall. Haruka hesitated outside their door, her hand gripping the knife so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could hear their soft, even breaths, the innocence of their sleep a stark contrast to the chaos she had unleashed. For a brief moment she considered walking away, sparing them, letting them live to tell the world what she had done. But the thought of leaving them behind, of allowing them to grow up with the memory of this night, was unbearable. She couldn't allow them to carry that burden. She entered the room quietly, her shadow stretching across the floor as the moonlight spilled through the window. Akira was the first to stir, his small face crinkling in confusion as he sat up and saw her. His soft voice broke the silence, and Ayumi woke moments later, her eyes widening in fear. Haruka's chest tightened as she moved toward them, her hands trembling for the first time. The twins cried out, their voices sharp and piercing, and Haruka's movements became frantic, driven by panic as much as purpose. The room was filled with the sound of their cries and her heavy breaths until, finally, it was silent again. When it was over, Haruka stood in the center of the room, her body trembling as she stared at the small, lifeless forms of her siblings. The knife slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor with a dull thud. Her clothes were soaked in blood, the metallic scent filling her nostrils and clinging to her skin. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes, the weight of what she had done crashing down on her like a tidal wave. She staggered out of the room, her steps uneven as she made her way back to her own bedroom. The house was deathly quiet now, the oppressive stillness broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Haruka sat on the floor of her room, staring at her bloodied hands, her mind racing. She felt numb, as though the events of the night had happened to someone else. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the weight of her actions. She couldn't bring herself to look at the knife lying on the floor, its blade glinting faintly in the moonlight. The storm inside her had finally been unleashed, leaving behind a hollow, echoing silence. As the first light of dawn crept into the sky, Haruka slipped out of the house, her bare feet leaving faint, bloodied prints on the cold ground. She wandered the streets of Tokyo aimlessly, her mind blank, the enormity of what she had done too vast to comprehend. The city was just beginning to wake, its streets quiet but alive, with the faint hum of life returning. Haruka kept walking, the knife and the horror she had left behind her fading into the background as she disappeared into the endless sprawl of the city. The Nakamura house sat eerily quiet as the first rays of dawn crept over the rooftops of Tokyo. The once lively household, filled with the chatter of children and the steady rhythm of daily life, was now a frozen tableau of horror. Blood stained the tatami mats, its stark red a jarring contrast against the soft beige. The silence was thick, as though the walls themselves were mourning the family they had sheltered for generations. The house was still, but outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the tragedy within. It wasn't long before the world began to notice. The alarm was first raised by the milk delivery man, a cheerful figure who usually exchanged pleasantries with Eiko on his morning route. That day, the house seemed unnervingly quiet. The sliding door, usually left slightly ajar to let in the morning air, was shut tight. The milkman knocked once, twice, then peered through a window. What he saw made him stumble backward, his voice shaking as he called the authorities. The first responders arrived quickly, their footsteps heavy as they approached the house. The scene that greeted them was one they would carry with them forever. The bloodstains on the floor, the still forms of the Nakamura family, the air heavy with the metallic tang of death, it was a sight that defied description. The officers moved cautiously, their voices low as they pieced together the events of the night. The sheer brutality of the crime was staggering. Each member of the family had been killed with precision, the wounds deliberate and calculated. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of forced entry. It was as though the killer had been among them, familiar with their routines and vulnerabilities. As the investigators began their work, a sense of unease settled over the neighborhood. News of the murder spread quickly, the once quiet street now buzzing with speculation and fear. Reporters gathered outside the police barricades, their cameras trained on the house as they scrambled for details. Neighbors whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. The Nakamuras had always seemed so ordinary, so normal. Who could have done something so horrific? The answer came hours later, when a patrol officer found Haruka wandering near the Sumida River. She was barefoot, her clothes soaked with blood, her eyes vacant and unseeing. She didn't resist when the officer approached her, didn't flinch when he gently took her arm. She didn't speak, her lips pressed into a thin line, her expression blank. The officer guided her to the patrol car, his voice calm and measured, but inside he was reeling. The girl looked so small, so fragile. It was impossible to imagine her as the perpetrator of such violence. And yet, the evidence began to suggest otherwise. Haruka was taken to the station, where she sat silently under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room. Forensic teams had already begun combing through the house, piecing together the sequence of events. The knife, found discarded on the floor of her bedroom, carried her fingerprints and traces of blood from every member of her family. Her footprints, faint but unmistakable, were tracked from room to room. Her sketchbooks, filled with dark, violent images, hinted at a mind unraveling under the weight of anger and despair. The detectives were at a loss. Haruka was only 13, a child by any standard. Yet the evidence painted a chilling picture of premeditation and control. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate her, their assessments conflicting and inconclusive. Some argued that Haruka had acted out of a psychotic break, her actions driven by a mind pushed beyond its limits. Others pointed to the meticulous nature of the crime, suggesting that it was the result of long-simmering resentment and a desire for control. Haruka, for her part, remained silent. She answered no questions, offered no explanations. Her eyes, hollow and distant, seemed to look past the investigators as though she were somewhere far away. The media descended on the story with relentless fervor. Headlines screamed of a child killer, their words dripping with sensationalism. Pundits debated the implications of the case, questioning the pressures of Japanese society, the treatment of children, and the role of mental health in such tragedies. The Nakamura family became a symbol of a larger conversation, their lives reduced to statistics and talking points. Haruka's name was whispered in fear and fascination, her face plastered across television screens and newspapers. In the weeks that followed, Haruka was transferred to a juvenile psychiatric facility for further evaluation. The court proceedings were swift but complicated, the question of her mental state taking center stage. Experts testified about her psychological profile, her history of isolation and neglect, and the circumstances that may have driven her to such extremes. The trial was closed to the public due to Haruka's age, but the verdict was widely reported. She was found guilty but mentally ill, sentenced to indefinite treatment in a secure facility. Inside the facility, Haruka's days were a blur of therapy sessions, medical evaluations, and quiet moments in her small, sterile room. She remained silent, her thoughts locked away where no one could reach them. The staff observed her carefully, noting her lack of emotion and her refusal to engage with others. Some saw her as a victim of a broken system, a child failed by those who should have protected her. Others viewed her as a cold, calculating killer, beyond redemption. Haruka, as always, gave no indication of what she thought or felt. The Nakamura house, once a symbol of stability and tradition, remained vacant. Its walls bore the scars of that night, the bloodstains scrubbed clean but the memories lingering like ghosts. Neighbors avoided the property, their eyes darting away as they passed. The tragedy became part of the neighborhood's lore, a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. For Haruka, the aftermath was a void. Days turned into weeks, then months, the passage of time marked only by the changing seasons outside her window. She no longer sketched, her hands idle as her thoughts spiraled inward. The weight of her actions hung over her, a constant, suffocating presence. She had sought control, sought to make herself seen, but in the end she had found only emptiness. Her family was gone, and she was left alone, a ghost in her own story. The investigation into the Nakamura family murders began with a grim efficiency, as Tokyo's law enforcement mobilized to understand the carnage left behind in the quiet residential neighborhood. The house, once a haven of routine and tradition, was now a sealed crime scene, its every corner meticulously combed for evidence. Detectives, forensic teams, and crime scene photographers moved methodically through the blood-soaked rooms, documenting every detail with clinical precision. Outside, the murmurs of curious neighbors and the click of reporters' cameras created a stark contrast to the heavy silence within. The first challenge for investigators was the sheer brutality of the crime. The wounds on each victim were precise, deliberate, suggesting not a random attack but one carried out with chilling intent. Forensic experts noted that the family appeared to have been killed in a specific order, starting with Kiji and Eiko in the master bedroom. The lack of significant defensive wounds indicated that most of the victims were taken by surprise, perhaps even asleep when the attacks began. The twins' room, however, told a different story. The disarray suggested a struggle, and the cries of the children, though ultimately silenced, had likely been the only sounds of resistance in the otherwise eerily quiet massacre. The investigators ruled out an external intruder almost immediately. There were no signs of forced entry, and the house's traditional sliding doors and windows were all intact. Moreover, nothing had been stolen. Cash, jewelry, and electronics remained untouched. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was personal. Attention quickly turned inward, and the scope of the investigation narrowed to the family itself. When Haruka was found wandering the streets in bloodied clothes, her face expressionless, the case took on a new, unsettling dimension. Haruka's apprehension raised more questions than answers. Initially, officers hesitated to see her as a suspect. At just 13, she seemed too small, too fragile to have committed such an atrocity. But as the evidence began to mount, the chilling possibility became undeniable. The knife, recovered from her bedroom floor, bore traces of her fingerprints, along with the blood of every victim. Her footprints, faint but discernible, were found leading from room to room, mapping her movements through the house that night. Her sketchbooks, discovered tucked beneath her mattress, revealed disturbing drawings of violence and death that mirrored the events now under investigation. The autopsy reports painted a clearer picture of the sequence of events. Kiji had been the first to die, his injuries indicating a sudden, brutal attack while he slept. Eiko had awakened moments later, her wounds suggesting a frantic but unsuccessful attempt to defend herself. The grandparents' deaths were swift, almost ritualistic in their precision, while the twins' final moments were marked by chaos and fear. The methodical progression of the killings pointed to planning and intent, traits investigators struggled to reconcile with Haruka's youth and apparent passivity. As Haruka sat silently in custody, the detectives pieced together her life in search of answers. Interviews with teachers, classmates, and neighbors painted a picture of a girl who had been largely invisible. Teachers described her as quiet but intelligent, though her grades had slipped in recent months. Classmates recalled her as distant, often lost in thought, and occasionally the target of teasing for her withdrawn demeanor. Neighbors, too, spoke of a girl who rarely ventured beyond the house, always overshadowed by her more outgoing siblings. The most revealing insights came from within the family itself. Extended relatives and family friends described a household ruled by strict discipline, with Kiji enforcing high standards that left little room for individuality. Haruka, they noted, had always been the quiet one, overlooked in favor of Ren's achievements and the twins' charm. Eiko, though kind in public, was often dismissive of Haruka at home, her attention consumed by her younger children. These details began to sketch a portrait of a girl who had been emotionally isolated, her sense of worth eroded by years of neglect and comparison. The forensic analysis of Haruka's sketchbooks provided further evidence of her unraveling mental state. The earlier pages were filled with landscapes and family portraits, but the tone shifted sharply in the months leading up to the murders. The drawings grew darker, featuring shadowy figures, jagged lines, and faceless forms surrounded by ominous symbols. One chilling image depicted a house with darkened windows and figures lying prone on the floor, a knife hovering above them. Psychologists examining the sketches suggested they were a reflection of Haruka's inner turmoil, a silent scream that no one had heard. The investigation culminated in a series of psychological evaluations, as the legal system grappled with how to handle such a case. Haruka's silence persisted throughout, frustrating both investigators and psychologists. She offered no confession, no justification, and no indication of remorse. When asked directly about the murders, she stared blankly, her eyes unfocused, as if the question didn't apply to her. Experts debated whether her detachment was a symptom of severe trauma or a sign of something more sinister. Some argued that Haruka had snapped under the pressure of her family's expectations and emotional neglect, while others suggested that her actions were premeditated, the result of a slow, deliberate descent into darkness. The media frenzy surrounding the case intensified as details emerged. Haruka was dubbed the silent killer, her face splashed across newspapers and television screens alongside photos of her family. Pundits dissected every aspect of her life, speculating about the role of societal pressure, family dynamics, and untreated mental health issues. The case sparked a national conversation about the hidden struggles of children in high-pressure households, though many saw Haruka's actions as beyond explanation or redemption. In the end, the investigation left more questions than answers. The evidence was clear, the sequence of events meticulously documented, yet the motivations behind Haruka's actions remained elusive. She was ultimately declared guilty but mentally ill, sentenced to indefinite treatment in a juvenile psychiatric facility. The detectives who worked the case moved on to other assignments, but the memory of the Nakamura family lingered, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can grow unseen. For the neighborhood, the house became a symbol of tragedy, its once vibrant walls now a silent testament to a family torn apart from within.